I still don't know what to make of that woman in Lajia. We don't have her name, no portrait, nothing but one small unfinished act. A bowl of noodles set down on a dirt floor, seconds before the ground gave out under her. The site is called Lajia in Minh County, Qinghai province, on a terrace above the Yellow River. It belonged to the Qijia culture, a Bronze Age society that farmed the stretch of the river roughly 4,000 years ago. Archaeologists describe a sudden combination of earthquake and catastrophic flood that buried the settlement within minutes. It happened so fast that human skeletons were found frozen mid-motion, adults curled over children, arms still raised. That's part of why some researchers have nicknamed Lajia China's Pompeii. Roofs caved in, walls dropped, and that bowl, sealed the instant it tipped over, disappeared underground for 4,000 years. Then, in 2005, a team led by Chinese Academy of Sciences researcher Hoyuan Liu excavated Lajia. They turned over an inverted earthenware bowl, buried nearly 3 meters down. Inside it sat noodles, still coiled, roughly 50 centimeters long, thin as the width of a chopstick. The bowl itself was a 3-legged ceramic vessel, typical of Qijia culture pottery. Radiocarbon dating of the surrounding sediment placed the burial event at roughly 4,000 calendar years before present. The find was significant enough to run in the journal Nature. And honestly, that one clay bowl ended an argument food historians had been having for over a century. Italy claimed pasta as its own invention, with roots reaching back to Roman-era dough dishes like lasagna. Arab food historians pointed to older dough traditions out of Sicily and the Levant, some documented in writing centuries before Lajia was even excavated. China said its noodle culture went back further than anyone could prove, but based only on later written records, not physical evidence. Lajia didn't settle every detail of that argument, but it settled the timeline. Someone in China was eating noodles roughly 2,000 years before Rome existed as a city. To get why that matters, you have to go back further, to a grain almost nobody outside China has heard of. Before rice paddies or wheat fields, there was millet, specifically 2 species, foxtail millet and broomcorn millet, domesticated independently in the Yellow River Basin somewhere around 8,000 years ago. At early farming sites like Sishan in Hubei province, archaeologists have found underground storage pits still holding carbonized millet husks. Millet needs barely any water. It tolerates thin soil, and it survives cold winters that would kill rice outright. That's exactly why it, not rice, became the crop that let people in northern China finally stop moving and build permanent villages. Picture one farmer on a plot the size of a backyard, harvesting by hand under a sky thick with dust off the Lus Plateau. His whole village lived or died by that harvest. Not metaphorically, a bad season meant a hungry, sometimes fatal winter. A good one meant surplus. And surplus changes people. Once a village makes more grain than it needs just to survive, it has time. Time to grind flour instead of boiling grain whole. Time to ask an odd little question nobody had needed to ask before. What happens if you mix this flour with water and shape it into something new? Here's the part that actually surprised food scientists when the Lajia bowl surfaced. Millet doesn't want to become noodles. Wheat contains gluten, an elastic protein network that lets dough stretch into long ropes without snapping. Millet has almost none of that structural protein, which is why modern millet flour is typically blended with wheat or egg just to hold together at all. By that standard, millet dough should fall apart long before it reaches noodle length. So how did someone 4,000 years ago pull strands nearly 50 centimeters long? Thin enough to eat, tough enough to survive burial for 40 centuries. Researchers examined the starch grains and plant silica residues under a microscope. Their conclusion: the answer was pure technique, not ingredients. Repeated stretching, repeated shaking, probably by hand, over a floured surface to stop tearing. A rhythm passed down person to person, because no writing system in that region was yet capable of recording a recipe. Somewhere in that village, someone had spent years, maybe a whole lifetime, perfecting a method that's basically still used today by noodle pullers in Lanzhou and Xi'an. Just with a different grain now. She wasn't thinking about food history. She was thinking about dinner, before the weather turned. It's worth sitting with that for a second. We tend to picture the Bronze Age full of warriors and stone monuments. Rarely a farmer's kitchen, a bowl of flour, hands testing the same motion over and over until it finally holds. But that kind of unglamorous persistence probably shaped civilization just as much as any battle ever did. The hand-pulling technique itself never really left China. Lanzhou's hand-pulled noodle trade, known as la mian, became formal enough by the late 20th century that the city's Noodle Restaurant Association codified 9 standard noodle widths in 1999. They range from hair-thin to flat, ribbon-like strands, each with its own name and its own place on the menu. A modern industry standard, built in a roundabout way on a stretching motion that may be 4,000 years old. Back to the dig itself for a moment, because the survival of that bowl really shouldn't have happened. This wasn't a controlled museum excavation. It was fieldwork on an active floodplain, where organic material almost never survives more than a few centuries. Grain rots, dough turns to dust. But this one pot flipped at the exact moment of collapse, trapping a pocket of air, sealing the noodles off from the moisture and oxygen that would have destroyed them under roughly 3 meters of sediment. Researchers ran 2 separate lines of evidence to identify what the noodles were actually made of: starch grain analysis and phytolith analysis, which examines microscopic silica structures unique to different plant species. Both pointed the same direction: foxtail and broomcorn millet, not wheat. That detail changes the whole story. If the noodles had been wheat-based, the discovery would have simply confirmed what many historians already suspected. Millet means Bronze Age cooks had already solved a genuinely difficult technical problem, with a grain actively working against them. For 1,000 years, say it slowly and it stops meaning anything. So here's a comparison. For 1,000 years ago, the pyramids at Giza were already old monuments to earlier generations, built roughly 6 centuries earlier. Stonehenge's largest stones were still being raised. Writing had only just been invented in a handful of places on Earth. Mesopotamian cuneiform was perhaps 1,000 years old, and Chinese script itself wouldn't be standardized in oracle bone form for several more centuries. And beside the Yellow River, someone had already figured out the noodle, with no written recipe to pass it on by. What the discovery doesn't prove, and the original Nature paper is careful about this, is that noodles were invented exactly once in exactly one place. Similar dough stretching methods may well have emerged independently anywhere grain flour met stubborn human patience, especially across Central Asia and the Middle East, where wheat farming is even older than in China, dating back roughly 10,000 years to the Fertile Crescent. What Lajia gave us wasn't a clean, singular origin story. It gave us proof, dated, physical, hard to argue with, that this simple, almost meditative act of stretching dough into strands is one of the oldest deliberate culinary inventions we know of. The identification itself hasn't gone entirely unchallenged, either, which is worth mentioning because it shows how this kind of science actually works. A follow-up study, published years after the original Nature paper, questioned whether the phytolith evidence could also be consistent with Job's tears, a different grain known scientifically as Koich's lacrima jobi. That reopened debate over exactly which plant produced the world's oldest known noodles. The original research team stood by the millet identification, and most food historians still treat Lajia as a millet noodle. But the disagreement is a useful reminder. Even a discovery this well documented isn't beyond scientific argument. By China's Han Dynasty around 2,000 years ago, the dish finally had a name in writing. The scholar Lu Shi, in his dictionary Shiming, compiled around 200 CE, records a term, tangbing, or soup cake, describing dough boiled in broth. It's one of the earliest surviving written references to noodle like food anywhere. By the Song Dynasty centuries later, the record gets far more specific. A text called Dongjing Meng Hua Lu, a memoir describing daily life in the capital Kaifeng before it fell in 1127, lists dozens of noodle shops by name, some open around the clock, serving broth noodles to shift workers and night travelers. Noodles, by then, weren't a curiosity. They were fast food. But names and city records don't spread on their own. People do. And sometimes for reasons with nothing to do with cuisine. One of the clearest documented cases is the Dungan migration of the 1880s. After Qing forces crushed a Hui Muslim uprising in northwestern China, Tens of thousands of Dungan refugees fled west, into what's now Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan, carrying their hand-pulled noodle dishes with them. Those noodles, still called lagman today across Central Asia, are a documented, dated transplant. Not a vague trade route rumor, an actual refugee population, settling with their recipes intact. Historians are less certain about earlier eras of spread, and they say so. In Japan, noodle culture likely arrived between the 8th and 12th centuries, with Buddhist monks whose diets leaned plant-based. Though early Japanese buckwheat was eaten more like a thick porridge than a sliced noodle. The technique of cutting buckwheat dough into thin strands, called sobakiri, doesn't show up clearly in Japanese sources until around the 16th century. Udon developed on its own track, tied to Japan's wheat-growing regions. Ramen is much younger than people assume, not ancient at all. Most historians place its emergence in the late 19th century, after the 1859 opening of the port of Yokohama created a Chinatown, where immigrant cooks served wheat noodle soup, then known locally as shina soba, to curious Japanese customers. What started as a novelty in a few port stalls became, within a century, a defining dish of Japanese food culture, eventually renamed simply ramen after the war. In Korea, court records tie naengmyeon, cold buckwheat noodles, to the Joseon dynasty, and to the country's harsh northern winters, since buckwheat tolerates cold terrain better than rice or wheat does. Every one of these traditions tells some version of the same story. A difficult grain, a stubborn cook, centuries of small, patient tweaks passed hand to hand, occasionally accelerated by war, exile, or a newly opened port. None of it happened because someone decreed it. It happened because somewhere, someone kept pulling the dough one more time than seemed reasonable. There's also a purely practical angle worth mentioning. Dried noodles were portable calories. A caravan crossing Central Asian deserts couldn't carry fresh bread that would spoil in days, but dried noodle sheets could survive weeks on the road. That durability, more than any cultural exchange, might explain a lot of the noodles spread along trade routes. Merchants weren't thinking about cuisine. They were thinking about what would still be edible after 3 weeks in a saddlebag. South of China, the base ingredient flips entirely. Rice, not wheat, ruled the fields of Vietnam, Thailand, and the Malay Peninsula. Picture one Chinese trader, sometime before European colonization reshaped the region, boarding a ship for northern Vietnam with silk and porcelain in the hold. Tucked in alongside it, something less glamorous, a method for grinding rice into paste, spreading it thin, and slicing it into long strands. He has no idea this quiet bit of craft knowledge eventually becomes pho. Most Vietnamese food historians place pho's emergence in the late 19th or early 20th century, around Nam Dinh, a northern Vietnamese textile town that housed one of French Indochina's largest cotton mills. Beef wasn't a big part of Vietnamese cooking before the French arrived. Pork and freshwater fish dominated. But French demand for beef created cattle markets and slaughterhouses near towns like Nam Dinh. The leftover bones and offcuts French households didn't want apparently ended up in local pots. Slowly building the long-simmered broth pho is known for now. Some linguists even argue the dish's name may echo the French pho, from pot au feu, the beef stew French colonists ate regularly. A theory still debated, but a striking one either way. Two empires, quietly colliding in one bowl of soup. Further west, a different mechanism produced a similarly engineered dish. Thai pad thai is not an ancient national recipe. It was actively promoted in the late 1930s and early 1940s by Prime Minister Plaek Phibun Songkhram, as part of a nationalist campaign to reduce Thailand's rice consumption during wartime shortages by encouraging citizens to eat noodles instead. The government reportedly ran public contests to name and standardize the dish, and pushed it through radio broadcasts and street vendor subsidies. A political campaign, not centuries of tradition, gave the world one of its most recognizable noodle dishes, name and all. Meanwhile, across Malaysia, Indonesia, and Singapore, waves of Chinese migration under 19th and early 20th century colonial labor systems, which recruited workers for tin mines and rubber plantations, brought whole noodle-making communities. They adapted recipes to local chilies, seafood, and coconut milk within a generation or two. It's easy to flatten all this into phrases like trade expanded, or The empire spread the crop. But that's not really what happened. It was one trader packing one crate. One cook adjusting one recipe for a customer who'd never had rice noodles before. One migrant family opening one small stall in an unfamiliar port town, with no idea their dish would still be served, mostly unchanged, over a century later. The pattern repeats across the region under different names: char kway teow in Penang, mie goreng in Indonesia, all descended from the same Hokkien and Teochew noodle frying techniques that migrant cooks carried with them, then adjusted, dish by dish, to whatever local market they landed in. Civilizations don't taste food. People do. One bowl at a time. Now here's a story almost everyone's heard. And almost none of it holds up. Marco Polo, 13th century, discovers noodles in China, brings the idea home, and Italy invents pasta. It's a great story. It's also fiction, according to basically every food historian who's actually checked primary sources. Dough-based foods existed in Italy and the wider Mediterranean well before Marco Polo ever left home. The clearest evidence comes from a 12th century Sicilian geographer named al-Idrisi, who wrote a massive geographical survey, known as the Tabula Rogeriana, completed in 1154 for the Norman king Roger II. In it, he describes a wheat product manufactured in the town of Trebia near Palermo, in quantities large enough to be shipped out across the Mediterranean by the shipload. Many historians read this as one of the earliest documented references to dried pasta production in Europe. Arabic sources call this kind of dried dough etria, a word that appears even earlier in the writings of a 9th century Baghdad cookbook author named Ibn Sayyar al-Warraq, 100 years before Marco Polo was even born. And centuries after Arabic writers, Sicily was already exporting the stuff. So where did the myth come from, if not from history? Historians trace it to something almost anticlimactic: a 1929 article published in the Macaroni Journal, the trade magazine of the National Macaroni Manufacturers Association in the United States. It was apparently designed to give American consumers a romantic backstory for a product they were trying to sell more of, rather than to record anything accurate. It spread. It got repeated in classrooms and cookbooks until people just assumed it was true. A marketing pitch turned into a myth, and the myth turned into common knowledge. What actually happened in Italy is messier, and frankly more interesting. Arab trade networks bringing dried wheat products through Sicily during centuries of Mediterranean exchange. Older Etruscan and Greek grain traditions predating Rome itself. And southern Italy's dry, warm climate, which was perfect for drying pasta long before refrigeration existed anywhere. By the 18 and 1900s, pasta was central to Italian identity, especially around Naples, where street vendors sold cheap macaroni to the urban poor, often eaten by hand before forks became common at street stalls. Industrial mechanization, including steam-powered kneading and extrusion presses introduced in the mid-1800s, let it be made cheap and fast for the first time. That turned it from a regional specialty into an everyday staple, and regional variation exploded along with production. Italy's National Pasta Museum in Rome catalogs more than 300 distinct named shapes, many tied to a single. Then Italian emigration did for pasta what Chinese migration had already done for noodles across Asia. Some 9 million Italians left for the Americas between 1880 and 1920 alone, and pasta traveled with them, first as homesick memory, then onto grocery shelves in places that had never grown a stalk of durum wheat. Nobody discovered pasta in some far-off land and brought it home in triumph. It was already there. The world just took a while to catch up. It's worth asking, too, why the myth was so easy to swallow in the first place. Marco Polo really did travel through China. He really did write about a country full of things that fascinated European readers for centuries. The lie wasn't built out of nothing. It got attached as one small, false detail onto a much bigger, genuinely true story, which is exactly why myths like this are so hard to kill once they take hold. Japan, 1945. The war's over, but the cities aren't recovering. Not yet. Bombing raids had leveled much of urban Japan, and food shortages weren't temporary. They dragged on for years, with rice rationing remaining in place well into the 1950s. In those first days and weeks after surrender, families lined up for hours for meager rations, while the black market quietly became one of the only dependable food sources in a lot of devastated cities. It's inside that specific wreckage that a businessman named Momofuku Ando, who had already founded a company called Nissan in 1948, started asking a question that sounds almost too simple. What if a hot, filling meal could be made in minutes with nothing but boiling water? Ando had already gone broke once. Earlier ventures, including a textile company, had collapsed, and he had done prison time over tax problems before rebuilding from close to nothing. Working out of a small shed behind his house in Osaka's Ikeda district, he spent months testing noodle dough late into the night, trying to figure out how to dry and preserve cooked noodles without wrecking the texture. The breakthrough came almost by accident. Watching his wife fry tempura batter in their kitchen, he wondered whether flash frying, which pulls moisture out of batter almost instantly, might do the same thing to noodles. It did. The method became known as instant flash frying, still used by manufacturers today. On August 25, 1958, Nissin released chicken ramen, pre-cooked, flash-dried noodles, reconstituted in minutes with hot water straight in the pack. It sold for 35 yen, roughly 6 times the price of fresh udon noodles at the time. And still it sold out almost immediately, partly because it needed no refrigeration, and partly because, in a country still climbing out of the wreckage of those first brutal post-war weeks, a meal that required no cooking skill and no fresh ingredients wasn't a convenience item. It was survival, sold for a few coins in a paper packet. Nissin followed it in 1971 with cup noodles, adding a disposable container and hot water alone as the only requirement. That pushed the product into vending machines, dormitories, and eventually outer space. Instant noodles have flown on at least one NASA shuttle mission, specially designed for astronaut Soichi Noguchi in 2005. The consequences didn't stay in Japan, and they didn't fade with that generation. Instant noodles spread across Asia and then the world, turning up in refugee camps, military rations, disaster relief kits, and the pantries of students and low-income families on every continent. According to the World Instant Noodles Association, global consumption in 2023 topped 120 billion servings, with China and Hong Kong alone accounting for over 42 billion of them, followed by Indonesia at roughly 14 billion. One ruined man, one backyard shed, one packet of dried noodles, built to solve a national crisis. And within a generation, it became one of the most eaten manufactured foods in human history. For 1,000 years separate that unnamed woman in Lajia from the instant noodle packet on a supermarket shelf right now. But trace it back far enough, patiently enough, and the line never really breaks. A millet farmer, solving a problem that should have been impossible, with no gluten to help her. A Dungan refugee in the 1880s, carrying a hand-pulled recipe over the mountains into exile. A cook near Nam Dinh, simmering French leftover beef bones into a broth that turns into pho. A Sicilian trader in Trebia, drying wheat dough for a Mediterranean-bound ship, a full century before anyone had heard the name Marco Polo. A ruined businessman in an Osaka shed, testing tempura batter at midnight, trying to feed a broken country one packet at a time. None of them set out to make history. They were just trying to make dinner. And that's really what sets the story apart from the usual parade of kings and conquests. Nobody planned it. Nobody funded it from the top down. It moved forward because ordinary people, across thousands of years and dozens of unconnected cultures, kept solving the same small problem. How do you turn flour and water into something worth eating and worth remembering the next morning? For 1,000 years, from a buried millet bowl to a 35 yen packet of chicken ramen, and well over 100 billion servings of instant noodles alone, now eaten every single year. Historians will keep arguing over the details. And honestly, they should. That's healthy. But the evidence, preserved by pure accident under a Bronze Age flood and confirmed by starch grains under a microscope, settles the one thing that actually matters. This dish is older than most empires that have ever existed, older than most major religions, and certainly older than any single country now claiming it as uniquely theirs. Somewhere tonight, in a cramped Tokyo ramen stall, a family trattoria in Naples, a plastic stool beside a Hanoi street cart, a noodle-pulling counter in Lanzhou, or a dorm room lit only by a microwave display, someone's about to eat some version of the exact idea that woman in Lajia was holding, seconds before the ground gave out under her. The bowls changed shape 1,000 times over. Millet to wheat, wheat to rice, fresh dough to a flash-fried block in a paper packet. The idea inside it never really has.